Thank you. Good evening and also good morning. This is Wang Huiyao, the founder and the president of Center for China Globalization that hosted this dialogue from CCG head office in Beijing. And so we are really pleased to welcome all of you to tune in for this CCG China and the World special dialogue series. And it's live from Beijing. Thank you for joining us today, actually. And so this is actually the 12th episode, and we are very honored and pleased to have two distinguished guests from George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China relations today. The Bush-China Foundation was founded in May 2017 by Neil Bush with blessing and support of President George W. Bush, and began full operations on September 2019. So this actually special dialogue event, it was actually as the background of the 50 years anniversary of course, Dr. Kissinger's visit to China, but also started the 50 years of exchanges with China and between China and the United States. But this year is also the 50 years of China joining United Nations. I remember George H.W. Bush was actually America's UN ambassador in 1971. That's when China joined the United Nations. So it's a great, it's not a coincidence, you know, China has started a different, you know, this kind of exchange with US 50 years ago. Now also it's the year of China joined the United Nations. Dr. Kissinger visited China in July, and China joined the United Nations in October in 1971, actually 50 years ago, half a century. So we know that for both President George H.W. Bush and of course also George W. Bush, I mean, it's very, very public history for the Bush family has two presidents of the United States. So with this background, I want to mention that for the George H.W. Bush, I mean, he actually was the U.S. envoy, and also maybe you can call a bicycle ambassador to China during the U.S. liaison office in Beijing between 1974 and 1975. And so that is really historic. So it's very, very pleased to see that we're actually talking about tonight about the Bush legacy and also the implications for China-US relations, and also in retrospect, half a century, but also looking forward for another future prospect of China-US relations. But also I'd like to say that the George H.W. Bush actually being the first liaison office ambassador to China, but also he was the president in 1989, and after 1 month in office, paid a visit to China, the soonest which took the office to visit China. And his son, George W. Bush, I mean, also Neil Bush's brother, had made a full visit to China. And so that's really impressive, including the 208 Olympic game that both Bush presidents actually visit China. So it's such a rememberable past of all the good relations we have. So I think that actually President George H.W. Bush actually said, we value the new relationship of our two countries, and also we have established each other, and so this is really a great moment to look at that. So what I'd like to introduce the two very distinguished guests actually joining us tonight is first is Neil Bush. Neil Bush is the founder and the chair of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China relations. He's the third of the 5 children of President and Mrs. George H.W. Bush. So Mr. Bush has actually been involved with energy, real estate, and international business development for the 4 decades, beginning in 1980. But for the past 25 years, Mr. Bush has engaged in various international business development activities with a focus on China. He first visited China in 1975 when his father was the chief liaison officer representing the United States in Beijing. His business and personal interests have allowed for many return trips over the years. Since 1975, Mr. Bush has traveled to China over 140 times and has visited over 40 cities in China. So it's a remarkable record. I think probably only Kissinger maybe has made that many trips. Probably you have made more than that. But also I'd like to introduce another distinguished guest tonight is David Firestone. He's actually the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, or you can call Bush-China Foundation, and also a founding and current member of the foundation board of directors. And prior to joining the Bush-China Foundation, Mr. Firestone was the founding executive director of the University of Texas, Austin, China Public Policy Center. And also he's a professor at the University of London B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Of course, before moving to University of Texas, Mr. Firestone served as a senior vice president and payroll fellow of the New York City-based East-West Institute, where he led the Institute's track to diplomacy dialogue. Mr. Firestone specialized primarily in the U.S.-China relations, so a very old friend of China, also very senior China hand. And of course, I remember we hosted you in 2012 when CCG hosted you there at the Western Return Scholar Association. You were giving an analysis of the U.S. Election, presidential election in 2012. So it's quite almost a decade ago. Now we see tremendous changes. So I would like to start the dialogue tonight with Bush Foundation and also the senior representative of Bush Foundation. So President George H.W. Bush was the pioneer in the U.S.-China diplomacy. He was the U.S. chief diplomatic envoy in China during the 1974-75, which was before U.S. and China formally established diplomatic ties. So Neil, you first, I remember you said somewhere, you first visited China in 1975, and of course continue to travel to China on a regular basis since then. So given you have made to China and traveled to China 100 sometimes, so you have witnessed actually firsthand in the last 4 or 5 decades of the tremendous changes that China has made. So maybe you can give your first assessment of what you see the relationship.
First of all, Henry, thank you so much for having us on your show as part of the dialogue. You do such wonderful work, bringing ideas out and helping to inform the public. I think I'll start by reflecting back on October of 1971. You mentioned that the Chinese were admitted, or China was admitted to the UN. I happened to be in New York City during that vote. My dad worked tirelessly promoting the two China representation concept. That was the position of the U.S. government at the time. They got voted down, and China was admitted. Taiwan was kicked out. The first thing my dad did when the Chinese delegation arrived into the United States was invite them to a lunch at my grandmother's home in Connecticut to show kind of American hospitality, to welcome them with open arms. And from that point on, his first real contact with Chinese leaders, my dad has, as you pointed out in the letter you referred to, has had an affection for the Chinese people and has high aspirations for how our two great countries should be working together. Yes, I was there in 1975. My 3 of my siblings and I visited for 5 weeks. We were in Beijing for 4 weeks and then traveled with my mother by train to Wuxi, Nanjing, and Shanghai. And it has been a remarkable thing to sit on the sidelines and to witness this incredible growth that China has experienced over the past 46 years when I was first there. The China I saw in 1975 and I don't want to be offensive to anyone, but was basically freedomless. Everyone was equal. They were equally poor. And that people were friendly towards us. We rode our bikes all over the place, and we were treated very kindly. But there was propaganda machines everywhere. Everywhere you go, the word was being spouted out. People were still being sent as the end of the Cultural Revolution, being sent to the countryside, and people couldn't make daily choices that clearly they can make today. And so, looking back 46 years later, if I were back in 1975, I couldn't have predicted or imagined that China would have had hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, that the middle class would be growing as rapidly as it is, that the economy continues to churn out new jobs and crank out wealth for people, that people would enjoy daily freedoms that frankly back then were clearly unimaginable, happening in China. So I've been deeply impressed by this, Henry. I'll be honest with you. And I think one of the things that separates me from other folks is the fact that I've been there and seen it grow over the many years. I've come to some deep conclusions. One, there's no single system that works for every country, that every country needs to develop a system that is suitable and fitting for the conditions of that country. China's system has worked for China. If you look at the results over the many years, over the 46 years since I was there, over the 40-something years since formal ties have been established, the results speak for themselves. And so I'm a believer that, our system works for us, your system, the Chinese system works for China. We need to be respectful of that, and clearly Americans. I've been amazed. I'll stop there and just say that I've been amazed to be able to witness this change in China, and no one could have predicted it back 46 years ago.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, Neil. Actually, absolutely, you are the witness of this great transformation that has been taking place in China in the last 4 or 5 decades. I mean, since China joined the UN, and of course, we re-established its position at the UN, but also, since your father as the first envoy to China in 1974-75, that is really how the US and China gradually normalized the relations and paved the way for the great progress. I'm glad to hear that your father actually hosted the launch for the incoming delegates to the UN. That was really early on. That's to show the, I'm sure that your father was 8 years as a vice president of Ronald Reagan, and also served as the president of the United States. I'm sure he has done a lot of memorable work, and also what he was saying, that the two great giants should work together. I mean, absolutely, for the benefit of the mankind. He's absolutely right. So what do you still remember some of the things you've seen at the Beijing? You said you're 4 weeks there. I remember your father was named bicycle ambassador. He ride a bike. Yeah. Famous photo at the Tiananmen Square. What about you? When you and your brother and sister came?
We had the same experience. We rode bikes all over the place. It was really fun. We rode to Tiananmen Square. I distinctly remember pulling up to a stop sign, where the guards were there with their hands up and stuff, and the crowd of bikes were stopped and gathered. And when those of us that were, from America, kind of white guys, long nose, they'd look over and see us, and they'd almost fall off their bikes. Yeah, we went to the zoo, Henry, to go see the pandas and other animals. And you look behind us, and there's a bigger crowd following us at the zoo than there were looking at the animals. We were such a, anyway, but it was a friendly, adventure for us. One of the things I observed, and this is something Dad and I talked about during that trip, was that if you observed Chinese consumers, Chinese individuals walking by like a bike shop, or a shop that had like kitchen utensils or whatever, you could see in their eyes that they wanted more, that they wanted a better bike, a better flying pigeon or whatever bike. And so it was, I don't know, it's pretty clear that there were aspirations even then that had now led to this incredible, growth and realization of potential. But yeah, no, I have vivid memories of it. And now I go back to China and, cars everywhere. It's like totally transformed. It's an amazing transformation, high speed rail and, internet connectivity everywhere. It's like a whole new world that couldn't have been imagined back in the bicycle riding days of the 1970s.
Yeah, great. You'll be really seeing China, develop from bicycle kingdom to an automobile kingdom, now the largest automobile market in the world. That was really, you see that in the 4 decades time.
Oh, and it's leapfrogged. I mentioned high-speed rail. I mean, other countries, other developed countries, or even developing countries in the world, have not been able to keep up with China in the deployment of high-speed rail. And I've been on many train rides that have been very efficient. They're quiet, they're fast, they're clean. And there's a leapfrog capability that China's enjoying that really sets it apart in many respects. Anyway, so yeah, it's gone from bicycles to the car consuming
Yes.
capital of the world, and also now leapfrog to the high speed rail.
Yes, that's right. You see that all the development stages. So David, and you also lived in China for many years, and you've been actually 20 years involved with China as well as a diplomat, but also now you are still working on this. So what's your impression on China, and probably also what now you are president of the Bush China Foundation now. So what is your memories, and also how do you think the Bush Foundation, for both Neil and you to take this forward? Maybe you can give me more discussion on that. David.
Well, Henry, thank you so much. And again, it's an honor to be with you, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. I first went to China in 1984, so 9 years later than Neil did. And yet I absolutely understand everything that Neil's saying in terms of the transformation that has occurred in China, and the degree to which average people since the 1970s and 1980s to the present date have seen their ability to make choices for themselves in their daily lives. That ability has grown in ways that, just as Neil said, were really unimaginable, I think, to the average Chinese citizen back in the 1970s or in the 1980s when I first visited China as a teenager. But just the ability to choose whether to go to college or what your major might be, or to choose to perhaps study abroad and do undergraduate work abroad rather than in China. The ability to choose where you live and to purchase a home, the ability to choose where you work or how long you work there. In the old unit system or danwei system back in the old days, you didn't have a say over where you worked and whether you could quit and so forth and so on. And now all those choices are available to average people all across the country. The ability to, have those kinds of decisions within your own grasp and within your own decision-making authority, that's probably the most fundamental transformation that I have seen in China, very much as Neil laid out. And I think if I were summarizing it in kind of one idea or one sentence, it would be that when I first visited China in the 1980s, I think the average citizen didn't feel that they had a lot of control over their own destiny with respect to these myriad really important decisions in their personal lives. But now, and certainly I think since the 1990s and unquestionably today, the average Chinese citizen, I think, feels that they have vastly more ability to shape their future than they did in the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. So it has been an incredible transformation. And of course, that's to say nothing of the physical transformation that's occurred in China and that you, Henry, and Neil were just discussing. At the Bush China Foundation, or the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, our mission is to advance the U.S.-China relationship in ways that reflect the ethos, spirit, and values of President George H.W. Bush. And as you mentioned at the outset, when Neil founded the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations with the blessing and support of his father, George H.W. Bush, that was very much the mindset. And I am so honored to be able to work side by side with Neil to carry forward the George H.W. Bush vision for the relationship. Henry, you mentioned one of President George H.W. Bush's most famous quotes when it comes to China, and it's one that we talk about all the time at the foundation. But I want to note that fundamentally, the George H.W. Bush vision for the relationship is grounded in two beliefs, core beliefs, I would say. Number one, that the U.S.-China relationship is the single most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. And in fact, I would say in the history of the world. And number two, that no major international problem or challenge can be enduringly resolved in the absence of effective U.S.-China cooperation. That's what President George H.W. Bush believed. That's what Neil believes. That's what I believe. And that's what our foundation is all about, is to try to facilitate U.S.-China engagement and collaboration, not out of altruism, but because it is good for both countries, it is good for the relationship, and it's good for the world. And I couldn't be more proud to work for and with Neil and to be a part of this incredible foundation.
Yeah, thank you, David. Actually, absolutely. I mean, you know, the Bush China Foundation has done many things. I noticed in the last 2 years, actually several years, you've done you know, the conferences, you've done you know, webinars related with many areas. So exactly, we need this foundation to actually to have better understanding and promote exchanges between our two countries.
Well, Henry,
yeah,
Henry, I'd like to piggyback off of that comment by reminding you and others that my dad, after he retired from the presidency, chose to be active in establishing dialogue, much like your program, Henry, between China and the United States. And he did so in the form of a conference, a U.S.-China relations conference that he co-hosted with an old friend, Madam Li Xiaolin, on the Chinese side. That conference he attended, he actively promoted, he brought in, you know, representation from the U.S. side, the Chinese side, you know, brought in equal representation. And for, I think he attended 5 or 6, David, do you recall? But he attended and hosted 5 or 6 of those. So that was basically the founding of our organization. Those are the roots of where our organization, you know, sprouted from. And as he got older and couldn't actually participate in these conferences, he asked me to chair from the U.S. side. And it just spun out. Out of that spun the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. And he was very pleased to see that the programmatic activity, starting with what he started, the conference, has now expanded to many other areas under David's very, very capable leadership. And by the way, I don't know if your audience would like to hear this, but David speaks like perfectly fluent Chinese. It's like apparently amazing Chinese. After 140 visits, you'd think I'd be able to say, you know, like one more beer, please. But that's about, or ni hao and sai jian. But anyway, David speaks fluent Chinese. He's a great leader for our organization.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, absolutely. I see that George H.W. Bush has actually started this tradition of this China-U.S. conference for many years. I remember many friends has attended that and has speak highly of the efforts of the conference in promoting the exchanges and the dialogues and the understanding of the two countries. But also, you know, in all this time, it is really very valuable, giving his advice and his presence. I'm glad that you succeeded him in doing this, and also now coupled with David. I know David is a perfect China hand. I mean, he spoke probably one of the best foreigners speak Mandarin that you could find. He has interpreted for many senior people too. So I remember when we invited David to come to speak at the CCG event in 2012. Which is almost 10 years ago. He he already impressed me then. And also he's writing 2 Chinese books. I mean, out of the several books written in China, two of them written in Chinese. That is very rare for any foreigners to see that. So this is actually really great legacy and great tradition that we have. And so somehow, you know, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, since both George, your father, George H.W. Bush, and your brother, George W. Bush, are both Republican parties and a Republican president, and has actually made the most visit. Your father stayed in China for a year or two. Your brother made a 4 presidential visit, and you know, 2 official visits, 1 APEC summit and 1 Olympic Games. You know, there's a lot of good you know, relationship building and you know, the dialogue exchanges. But somehow, unfortunately, you know, for the last several years, I mean, probably the last 5 years, particularly since Republican President Trump took the office, we see China-U.S. relations somehow, you know, deteriorate quite a bit. And so this kind of deterioration, you know, we don't know what are the reasons, but definitely, even now President Biden comes up, they're still saying, okay, China probably somewhat better now, but still, they say China can be cooperative, can compete, but also can be a rivalry. So we don't want to be a rivalry. But also President Trump started this trade war, trade sanctions with China. We see many Republicans actually calling for lift those tariffs, as I was just talking recently with Wendy Cutler, the former acting USTR, and she was saying, you know, maybe we should lift those tariffs. It's no good for China, so for US as well. And recently, US-China Business Council have done a survey that find this tariff actually cost US almost 250,000 jobs and many costs. But still, China and US trade is still, China imported as much as, you know, increase in steel, and also the trade has increased. So what do you know, assess this current China-US relations, and how we can really improve that, how we can really maybe get a bit normalcy there, rather than we are now in such kind of deteriorated position. How can we, both countries, work better towards a better relation, given your foundation's view, maybe your personal view as well?
You know, I might take a high level stab at this and then let David dive deeper. Sure. First of all, you referenced the deterioration in the relationship, and it strikes me that there are a number of converging factors that have led to the U.S. side becoming fearful of China's rise, and that fear is reflected in rhetoric that has become, under the Trump administration, quite harsh, and with that became kind of an isolationist approach of stepping back and not having dialogue. My dad believed at his core that, you know, that countries and families and friends, you know, need to stay in touch with one another in order to better understand one another, in order to put yourself in the other guy's shoes, so that when conflict arises, you can address those conflicts in a mature way. We got away from that for 5 years or so, and maybe even prior to that. David can give his analysis. That coupled with the U.S. problem of kind of America first, build the wall, anti-immigrant, you know, we're the greatest country on the face of the planet, and to see China's economic rise to where it's now at parity or, you know, just behind the U.S. economy on a gross basis, not per capita, but on a gross basis. You know, there are a lot of politicians, you know, are fearful of losing our prominence in that way. And then a third factor is politically, given that there's not very good information about China floating around in this you know, ecosystem in the U.S. Politically, China's an easy target. You know, we see politicians blasting the Communist Party as though it was the party that was kind of manifested itself in different ways very early. in the People's Republic of China's history. I'll quickly hasten to add that clearly any bilateral relationship is going to have issues between countries. We have issues with France, we have issues with Germany, we have issues with Israel, we have issues with our closest friends. We're going to have issues with China, and we're going to address, as Americans, we have values that we stand firmly behind. We're going to express those values in a way, hopefully in a way that's respectful and not finger pointing or in a derogatory way, but we'll express our values in the hopes that we can help shape outcomes and that kind of thing. But the ultimate goal should be to come together as often as possible in as many different ways as possible, and to resolve challenges, respectfully and maturely. I'm going to let David, talk about the tariffs thing. My view of the tariffs is it was such a stupid idea to start with. The idea of raising tariffs that was a tax to American consumers, hurting American business, which, David can get into the statistics, that there's nothing in economics 101 that says that a trade imbalance is unnatural or inappropriate or bad. And so it was a silly thesis in the first place. I think it may have been deep down inside, the logic might have been to be punitive towards the Chinese, to try to set the Chinese economy back. But that was illogical as well. So it was a failed policy that needs to be reversed. And anyway, David, I'll let you clean up my mess. Go ahead.
Thank you. You raised a lot of good points. Thank you. Yeah, no, David, please.
Well, Henry, thanks. And Neil, thank you. And just to pick up on the really good points that Neil made about tariffs. I mean, Neil and I both, even before we met each other 3 years ago, were both, very much, very critical of the U.S. policy on tariffs and the Trump tariffs, on the same grounds that they're bad for America. They're bad for American companies. They're bad for American workers. They kill jobs. They blow out the deficit, and they do nothing to solve any of the core problems that actually do exist between the United States and China in the trade area. And I agree fully with everything Neil just said with respect to tariffs. And we as individuals and as a foundation have been very outspoken, maybe more outspoken than almost any other entity in the country when it comes to the how bad for America the tariffs are. Let me cite a couple of things, and then I'll move, Henry, to the broader question that you've asked. But I think this needs to be said. I mean, the numbers are in, the jury is in with respect to the tariffs. We don't have to speculate or offer opinions about it. We can actually look at the factual record. Under President Trump, we had the highest U.S. trade deficit with China in American history. Under President Trump, we had the highest average annual merchandise trade deficit with China of any presidency in the history. So to compare apples to apples, the entire presidency, the average annual deficit with China was higher under Trump than any other previous presidency. So those numbers speak for themselves. It wasn't just a one-year wonder type of phenomenon. It was 4 years. The U.S. trade deficit with the world grew to record levels under President Trump. We lost manufacturing jobs, tens of thousands of them under President Trump. We lost jobs overall, 250,000, as Neil just cited from the U.S.-China Business Council, under these imbecilic policies. The historic U.S. trade surplus with China in agriculture became a trade deficit for the first time in 25 years, something that none of us thought was even possible. And of course, American consumers ended up paying more, to the tune of about $1,000 or even $2,000 a year, more than they were before the tariffs came into play. By every single metric that you could possibly cite, the tariffs were just exactly as Neil said, an absolutely failed policy that was horrible for America, is horrible for America, and we need to get rid of it. The Trump tariffs were predicated on the idea that comparative advantage doesn't exist. And that is as un-Republican and un-American a thought as you could ever conceive. Comparative advantage does exist. And we have to get back to the idea that the pie gets bigger when countries produce what they're best at producing. And even imperfect trade is better than no trade. So we've got to get back to classical American thinking. And I want to say, before I transition just briefly, Henry, to your other question, that the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China relations, true to the values and beliefs of President George H.W. Bush, is a pro-business, pro-trade, pro-globalization organization, unapologetically, because we understand economics and we understand that trade is good for America, it's good for the world, and we want to move back in that direction, and we advocate in that direction. The point that I want to make is that for most of the last 50 years, up until about 5 years ago, the idea that engaging China and having a constructive and robust and healthy and functional relationship with China, it was not just a Republican idea. It was a bipartisan consensus that held through the presidencies of 7 or 8 presidents dating back to Nixon and through the end of the term of President Barack Obama. It only changed during President Trump's campaign and as he came into office. But there has always been a bipartisan consensus that it is good for America to engage China, notwithstanding the difficulties and I would frankly say the irreconcilable differences that we have between our countries. Even with all of that, that there is value and benefit to engaging China, working together, being clear-eyed about the relationship, certainly, but coming together to solve problems that neither country can solve on its own. That consensus has existed up until the Trump era. Now we have a new consensus, unfortunately, in official Washington, and that is that China is really the enemy of our nation. There's a vast swath of official Washington that seems to believe that. And there's a significant swath of the American public that has come to believe that. I think Neil and I and the Bush-China Foundation reject that idea and that belief. But I think that belief is rooted in 2 erroneous assessments of China's intentions. One, that China seeks to displace the United States and supplant the United States as the world's only superpower. And I think that is an absolutely fundamental misreading of what China actually wants to do. And number 2, that China seeks to replicate its system all across the world and create a bunch of countries that look exactly like China, and basically to push forward its system across the world, so that there are more systems that look like China's than there are today. I think those are incorrect understandings of what China actually seeks to do. And when the fundamental premises of U.S. policy toward China are wrong, the resulting policies that purport to address those concerns are going to veer off course. And I think that's what we've seen over the last several years. So, we need to have a sharp focus on U.S. interests and to get the emotions out of our policy formulation and policy execution, and focus, as President George H.W. Bush did, on the long-term interests of our nation. And I think if we do that, we can get this